Hello, hello, hello. This is Dr. Mandik, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. This is Lecture 7. It's the last lecture about ethics, and we're going to be talking about something called virtue ethics. And one of the things that I want you to be keeping an eye out for as you listen to this lecture about virtue ethics is the way virtue ethics relates to other ethical theories, in particular utilitarianism and Kantianism. You'll get a sense of the differences between those theories in this lecture. And another thing to keep an eye out for is the way in which ethics interacts with other areas in philosophy, in particular metaphysics. So some of the discussion today is going to be focusing on the relationship between certain virtue ethics approaches to ethics and metaphysics. The schedule for this lecture is to hit three things. The first one is to give an overview of virtue ethics in general, and then we're going to look in parts 2 and 3 at two particular very famous and influential examples of virtue ethics: the theory of Aristotle, his approach to ethics, and the theory of Nietzsche and his approach to ethics. So let's start with our overview of virtue ethics. At the heart of virtue ethics is the idea of virtue. What is a virtue? Well, one way of thinking about a virtue is it's a property of something. A more relevant way of thinking about virtue is that it's a property of a person, and more specifically, it's in some general sense a valuable property of that person. And if we think about virtue that way, the opposite of virtue is vice. So someone has virtues or they have vices. If they have virtues, they are virtuous, and if they have vices, they are vicious. So we might say virtues are good qualities or characteristics, specifically of people, and we might note that some virtues are specific to particular tasks. So, for example, having really strong legs is a virtue relative to riding a bicycle, but maybe it's not really a virtue to being a writer. In order to be a writer, it doesn't really matter how strong your legs are, even if you have legs. Okay, we want to specifically focus on moral virtues or ethical virtues, the virtues that really are relevant to ethical evaluations. So having strong legs might be good in some sense of good, maybe an athletic sense of good, but it's not really ethical or moral the way in which being courageous is something that is relevant to ethics. Somebody who acts courageously, we might say, is morally more likely to be praiseworthy as opposed to blameworthy. Other examples of virtues in this moral sense, besides being courageous, would involve being compassionate, being merciful, charitable, having patience. One way to understand what virtue ethics is all about is to think of the way it contrasts with other general approaches to ethics. So on this slide here, there's a bunch of ethical theories represented, and then they're grouped into three groups. So some of these are theories that we haven't focused on and aren't really going to focus on, like, for example, hedonism or theological ethics. Although we did talk about theological ethics somewhat when we were discussing religious approaches to ethics and something that we called divine command theory. We really focused a lot on utilitarianism and Kantianism. And then in this lecture, we're going to focus a bit more on Aristotle's theory, Aristotelianism, and Nietzsche's theory, Nietzscheanism. Now, these different ethical theories, utilitarianism, etc., can be put into three groups. So utilitarianism gets grouped under consequentialism along with hedonism. utilitarianism and hedonism both care about consequences, and they try to explain everything in ethics by taking the idea of consequences as being the most basic idea. Deontological theories, in particular Kantianism, they take consequences to not be as important. They don't say that they're not important at all. They just don't think that they're the ultimate importance in ethical thinking. What they do think of as what's most ethically basic, the deontological theories, is action, specifically the rightness or wrongness of actions. They take those to be basic, and then they try to explain everything else in terms of them. So let's talk about a contrast between utilitarianism and Kantianism along these sorts of lines. So over here we've got different sorts of ethical properties and the sorts of things that have those properties. So there's the ethical property of goodness, which is something that applies to ends. Remember the phrase, the ends justify the means, that goes along with consequentialism. So ends are things that can be valued, that can be sought. So you might seek money or you might seek friendship. Actions, it's not proper to say that actions are good or bad. It's more proper to say they're either right or wrong. Actions are the sorts of things that you're either morally obligated to do or morally prohibited from doing, or in other words, morally obligated to not do. So we've got a contrast here between ends and actions. Those are two, we might say, logically distinct sorts of things. Something is an end versus something is an action. In action, you might perform that action to accomplish an end, and then there's the end itself. Now, what's the most important of these when it comes to trying to explain ethics? Well, the Kantian and other deontological theories are going to think that action is the most basic and most important. The consequentialist thinks that ends are the most important, and they sum that up by saying the ends justify the means. So for the utilitarian and for the hedonist, the ends that are most important are ends that have to do with pleasure or happiness. And the main difference between the utilitarian and the hedonist has to do with whether we're talking about pleasure for just yourself or pleasure for the larger society in which you're a member. Okay, so hopefully you've got some basic grasp now of a contrast between, for example, utilitarianism and Kantianism in terms of what they think is the most basic or important for ethics. If you bring up a question like, what makes it wrong to murder? What makes it wrong to steal or tell a lie? A consequentialist is going to say, well, it depends on what consequences that brings about. It's going to depend on what ends that leads to. They're going to say that because they think the ends are the most important thing in thinking about ethics. The Kantian, for example, is going to say the ends don't matter. Like sometimes the ends might be desirable ends, maybe they might be undesirable ends, but you can't figure that out first. You figure that out later. First you have to figure out what actions are right versus what actions are wrong, and then you take it from there. The Kantian is going to tell you which actions are right or wrong is going to be based on the categorical imperative. The theological ethicist or divine command theorist is going to say, well, what actions are right or wrong depends on what the law laid down by God is. You have to consult something like the Ten Commandments, and then you take it from there. Enter virtue ethics. Virtue ethics says both of these approaches, consequentialism and deontologism, start off on the wrong foot. Maybe it is important to talk about action and end, but it's not the most important. The most important is to focus on people themselves. And, well, what about people? You're going to see in both of these ethical theories that we're calling examples of virtue ethics, the aspect of people that is most important is some kind of general sense of what you might call health, or you might call flourishing. Some general sense of what it means to thrive as a human being. If you focus on that, make that the most basic thing, then you'll have the most satisfying general ethical theory, and you'll be able to answer in a satisfying way other questions, like questions about what makes an action right or wrong, or what ends are the ends that are worth pursuing. But the virtue ethicist doesn't make the ends justify the means is the most important thing, nor do they make actions the most important thing. They save that for later. They start off with people and which characteristics of people are most conducive to thriving, flourishing. Now, we're going to see when we focused on, for example, Aristotelianism, virtue ethics can be traced back for thousands of years. But the discussion of virtue ethics in the contemporary philosophical discussions, in a lot of ways, starts off in 1950s, especially with the philosopher Elizabeth Anscombe. Um, Anscombe published a paper in 1958 called Modern Moral Philosophy, in which she criticized the then dominant traditions of Kantianism versus utilitarianism, and said that they both were really kind of doomed to fail. And one way in which she stated the problem with these theories is that they were essentially legalistic. They were trying to approach ethics as a set of laws, but they were hampered by their secularism. By not having God in the picture, they were trying to figure out laws without any lawgiver. There was no legislature or executive branch, because so many of the theorists didn't think God existed to do that. You might say, well, wait, don't people exist to do that? Aren't there people that work as judges or senators, legislating laws? Well, that's legal law. We're talking about moral law, the ethics that is the foundation to coming up with a just government, something that presumably comes before the government and the ensuing laws of the state. Now, if ethics itself is law, doesn't there need to be a lawgiver? But wait a minute, if you're an atheist or an agnostic, then you can't make any kind of reference to God. Or you might think the Euthyphro dilemma blocks the usefulness of appealing to God in an ethical context, even though you might personally believe in God. Anyway, there's a widespread approach to ethics that is trying to come up with something that's secular, something that doesn't make essential reference to God. And Anscombe thinks that that's doomed. Either you have to bring God back, or you have to do something else than what the utilitarians and the Kantians were doing. And what is that something else? Well, that is to focus on an account of human flourishing and see what you can take from there. So a lot of people started looking back at some older theories, even though this was written in 1958, and in a sense introduces a renewed focus on virtue ethics. It isn't the invention of virtue ethics. The invention of virtue ethics goes back at least as far back as Aristotle, thousands of years ago. So let's start with Aristotle and then move on to Nietzsche. But before we get to Aristotle, we should sum up a little bit what's generally going on with virtue ethics. So we're not quite done with our first part. But here's some general statements about virtue ethics, of which Aristotle's ethics is one example. So morality isn't about rule following, nor is it about outcomes. It's not about good and bad actions. Although, sometimes that comes up, but at its foundational level, what it's about is being a good person. Being a good person, well, what's that? What does it mean to be a good person? Is it to be a tall person? Is it to be a person with a lot of money? Well, maybe not, but what really matters to making a person a good person is a person who is flourishing, who's, it's tempting to say that what we're talking about is health, what it means to be a healthy person, but in a perhaps broad sense that is not just limited to physical or medical health, but might include beyond that mental health, or even we might say social and emotional health in the most broad and general way in which someone can be healthy. And it might even go beyond being healthy. Because sometimes we talk about health simply in terms of maintaining a bare minimum, but you might want to go beyond that. You might want to excel and be excellent, not simply be alive without disease, but to go beyond being alive and disease free and being an excellent athlete, or more broadly, beyond the physical realm, being an excellent musician or an artist, or maybe just an excellent friend, or maybe an all around excellent person. So, we're going to be talking a lot about, when we talk about virtue ethics, what does it mean to be, in general, an excellent person? What does it mean to be a person who flourishes? Flourish is maybe not a word you use a lot in your everyday conversations. So let's look at the dictionary and talk about the proper sense of flourish as we're going to use it here. So what does it mean when we say flourish as a verb in this context? This is a pretty useful definition for us right here. So what it means to say that a person, or maybe an animal or living thing more generally, is flourishing, is to say that it grows or develops in a healthy or vigorous way, especially as the result of a particularly favorable environment. So wild plants flourish on the banks of the lake. Now we're going to be focusing on people, what it means for people to flourish. You might have a good sense of what it takes for a plant to flourish. Or maybe you have pets, you know what it takes for a goldfish or a dog to flourish. But now think about people in general. Some of you watching this video are parents. You have children of your own, and you probably think about what it takes for kids to flourish in the context of your role as a mother or father. Or maybe you have had to take care of your siblings growing up. Or maybe you just are interested in things like education. You want to become someone who takes care of people, either as an educator, or maybe you're going to go into the health sciences, or maybe you're going to be a social worker or an industrial psychologist. Lots of people have lots of ideas about what constitutes human flourishing. What are the conditions that are the best in general for people, and when are people at their best? That is the question of flourishing. And different philosophers are going to have different views about that, slightly different, or maybe even very different views about what flourishing consists in for a human being. So, okay, let's go to our second part and talk about the philosophical views of Aristotle. And like I had mentioned earlier, I want you to be keeping an eye out for the ways in which metaphysics and ethics interact in these discussions of virtue ethics. So here's a little bit of metaphysics that comes from Aristotle. If the eye were an animal, then sight would be its soul. What's metaphysics? What's metaphysical about this? Well, we're talking about existence, and we're talking about existence in a very fundamental way. We're talking about the existence of the soul and its relationship to living things. So, what does it mean to have a soul? You might think that what it means to have a soul is that there's a special kind of thing associated with you besides your body. It's a spiritual thing which could exist independently of your body, like a ghost or a spirit. That's one kind of metaphysical view of people. It's a view called dualism, and we'll talk about that a lot more later on in the semester. Another approach to the question of what is the metaphysical nature of people is to say, as Aristotle did, that the soul is not a thing that's separate from you, but it's more like a process or an activity. Sometimes this gets discussed in terms of the relationship between software and hardware. That's not the way Aristotle would put it. He didn't have electronic computers back when he was thinking about these things. But we have electronic computers, and we understand the difference, roughly, between hardware and software. The hardware is the machine, the wires and circuits. The software is the information. It's something like what the machine is doing or what the machine is performing. We might think of another example, like the relationship between a dancer, that's a person, and a dance, the dance that they're performing. The dance is not a thing in the way that a person is a thing. A person can be weighed. You can put them on a scale and weigh them. They have a shape, but the dance is a process. It's not another thing. And one way to understand what Aristotle is saying about the soul is that it's more like a process than another thing. So, what about what is it about eyeballs? What's he saying? If an animal was an eye, then sight would be its soul. Well, think about the relationship between an eyeball and sight. What is that relationship? And one thing you might say is sight is more than what an eye does. Sight is what an eye is supposed to do. Sight is what an eye is about. It's what it's for. We might say it's the purpose of an eye. So there's lots of things eyes can do. One thing an eye can do is to keep your contact lenses warm. But we might say that's not the purpose of an eye. The purpose of an eye is to see. And that's very important to what Aristotle wants to be saying about the soul. The soul is something like the purpose, the function that you ought to be performing. That's your soul. If an eyeball was an animal, then its soul would be sight. Its soul is the thing it's supposed to be performing. Okay, so if sight is the soul of this eyeball creature, what is the soul of a human being? What is the purpose that a human being is supposed to be performing? Well, one way that Aristotle talks about this is that when a person conducts their activities in accordance with reason, they are living their best life. They are achieving their greatest ends. So an eyeball would be at its best when it's able to see and see clearly. A person is at their best when they're able to reason and reason well, and further have their actions in their life be guided by reason. So they're not just sitting around and thinking, but they're leading lives that are thoughtful lives. Now, this is supposed to be an example of virtue ethics. Where do virtues fit in here? And Aristotle's got a specific view of how virtues fit in here. The way virtues fit in here is that a virtue is always in the middle of two extremes. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a second. So let's skip up here. Okay. So the golden mean, the golden average. You've got, perhaps for many of you, you'll relate to the example of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And you remember the part where they're talking about this is too hot and this is too cold and this is just right. Well, that's kind of what Aristotle's talking about when he talks about things being right in the middle of two extremes. So if you've got really cold oatmeal, well, that's not desirable. But if you have really hot oatmeal, that's not desirable either. You're going to burn yourself. You're not going to enjoy the oatmeal unless it's somewhere in the middle, the sweet spot, the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, just right. And there's all sorts of different properties of people that we could say can be put on a scale. And if there's too little, that's not good. If there's too much, that's not good either. But if you get it right in the middle, you got the sweet spot, that's good. So that's what it means to talk about virtues being in the middle of two extremes. So let's take a few examples. So on this first row here, we've got a scale from stingy to wasteful, and in the middle is generous. So let's start in the middle. It's good to be generous. We appreciate that. That's a virtue. People that are generous are virtuous. But what if someone was too generous? Is that possible? I think a lot of us would acknowledge that it is possible. There is such a thing as being too generous. Someone who every time they get some money, they give it away. You might say, well, that's the Christ-like thing to do. That's like being like Jesus, and that's good. Other people would say, well, that's good for Jesus, but you can't live your general life like that. You've got to at least take care of yourself. And if you have a family, if you've got, for example, children, you've got to take care of them. And it would be wrong to give all your money away and let not feed your children because you're going to be feeding some strangers. So you might say that you've got to be able to take care of yourself at a minimum, and you've got loved ones you have to take care of too. So there is such a thing as being too generous. You have to be a little bit selfish to take care of those that are immediately connected to you. But you might say, well, shouldn't you be super selfish and be ultra rich, like try to keep as much money as possible and get yours and try to be number one? Well, I don't think we appreciate that. We would generally say that that's a good thing, that What we're dealing with is someone like the character of Scrooge from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Scrooge was not an example of a desirable person. You might say that even though he had all that money, it didn't buy him happiness. It didn't buy him a good life. It didn't buy him loved ones. You can't buy love. You can't do it. You can maybe buy things that are similar to love. You could attract a bunch of people that want to hang around with you and get your money. Or maybe you could pay someone to have a conversation with you. But that's not the real deal. The only way to get the real deal is to be a bit generous. Let's take another one. So on this scale, we've got in the middle courageous. That's a virtue. And it is possible to be too courageous. And you might even know people that just are too risky. They take too many risks. And is that courageous? Well, it's more than courageous. It's reckless. And you might say that's a bad thing, being reckless. Someone who doesn't take account of their own safety whatsoever, someone that just charges into battle without even making sure that they have a helmet or ammunition in their weapon, they're an idiot who's going to get themselves and maybe other people killed too. So it's good to be courageous, but you want to be a little bit cautious. If you're a little bit cautious, you could better take care of yourself and everyone else and be better at being courageous. Now, so even though it's bad to be reckless, it's also bad to be totally cautious. If you're too cautious, then you're a full-out coward, and that's not good for anybody anyway. You might avoid some problems, but you're going to create more problems by being a coward. So it's important to be able to stand up for yourself and to be able to stand up for others, and that's where courage becomes a good thing. But it is possible to have too much courage. So here's a second example then in which, according to Aristotle, a virtue is something that is in the middle of two extremes. There are other examples besides. So we might skip down to the bottom here. It's good to be ambitious, but there is such a thing as being a workaholic, working too much. But there's also such a thing as being a sloth, being a lazy bum. And it's good to be somewhere in the middle. Okay, so that was a couple thousand years ago, Aristotle and Aristotle's virtue ethics. And I want to move on in a little bit and talk about Nietzsche. But first, let me go back a little bit to Aristotle and do some kind of general review. So here's some major concepts that go along with Aristotle. The most important one is what I've been calling human flourishing, and you might encounter discussions of something called eudaimonia, which is a Greek word that gets translated into human flourishing. Eudaimonia might be translated literally as something like a good spirit or good soul. Human flourishing is an adequate translation as well. So there's a couple ideas here. So one is the idea of the purpose of a thing. So just like an eyeball has a purpose, the purpose is to see, and your heart has a purpose, the purpose is to pump blood, so does a whole organism have a purpose. And your purpose as a human being is to be rational. Man, or humans, are rational animals. And then what the virtues are the excellent exercise of reason. And when is it excellent? Well, it's excellent when it's in the middle of two extremes. Not too much, not too little. It's good when it's in the middle. So that's Aristotle. You might say it's a little bit boring. Being virtuous, being a Goldilocks person, you're not too hot, you're not too cold. You might say, this is the good life. If you talk to people that have lived for a long time and ask them what they would consider to be a good life, they might give you an answer that's not super exciting as a young person, but maybe peace is the ultimate goal. You want to be happy and healthy and have friends and relax, and that's the good life. When we turn to Nietzsche, we're going to see an approach to virtue ethics that maybe is a little bit more exciting. You might even say a little bit more kick-ass. You might say it's a little bit too kick-ass, but we'll see. But maybe you'll ask yourself, what if you had to pick between Aristotle and Nietzsche, who makes the most sense to you? Who seems to have a better grasp on how to think about what it means to flourish as a human being? So Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher from the 1800s, and you may have heard of Nietzsche before. He's pretty famous, pretty popular philosopher. A lot of people encounter him. Maybe in high school you've heard about him and read a little bit about him. There's certain ideas that are very closely associated with him. A lot of people have heard of, even if they know just a little bit of philosophy, they may have picked up some of this. So one idea is the idea that God is dead. And this is an expression not just of atheism, the idea that God does not exist, but it's a broader idea that includes the idea that the idea of God doesn't have any relevance for our culture anymore. I'm not saying this is true, but Nietzsche was saying that it's true. So what it means for God to be dead is not that he literally was alive and then he died, but that the idea of God is a dead idea. And if we want meaningfulness, if we want meaning in our lives, we can't expect to get it from God. Another thing that's very closely associated with Nietzsche is the idea of the Ubermensch. Ubermensch is German. We might translate Ubermensch as something like overman. The Ubermensch is the overman. Or another way we might translate it is Superman. The Ubermensch is a Superman, someone who's more than a regular person, but they are a super person. Now, what kind of super person are we talking about? We talk about someone like a comic book superhero, someone who could fly or shoot lasers out of their eyes. No, we're talking about something that is much more relevant to ethics. We're talking about someone who goes above and beyond. Other ideas that are closely associated with Nietzsche, the idea of a contrast between two kinds of morality, what Nietzsche calls slave morality and master morality. And this goes along with some of his remarks along the lines of God being dead and some of his criticisms of Christianity. A lot of what people think of as being ethical or being moral, according to Nietzsche, are just things that are keeping people enslaved. That these are ideas that have been created by the ruling class and put on the lower classes to keep them lower. These are ways of controlling the crowd or tricking the crowd into controlling itself. So the idea of slave morality is the idea of the morality of a conquered people who are so conquered that they now conquer themselves. And in contrast is the morality of the masters, the people that are in control, the people that have it all, and the morality that they apply to themselves. You might wonder, if you could choose to live any kind of life, if you could choose who you're going to be, well, what kind of morality would you have? If you could completely design your life from the ground up, what would morality be in that life? What would make that life meaningful? And this relates to one of the strangest ideas associated with Nietzsche. And this is the idea of eternal recurrence. The idea of eternal recurrence we might put by saying it's the idea that time is a loop, time is a circle, that what was in the past will happen again and be in our future, and then happen again and just keep going round and round. Everything that happens is going to happen again, and it's going to keep on happening. That is the idea of eternal recurrence, the eternal return of the same. You might say, oh, that sounds really weird and really far out. What does that even have to do with ethics? It sounds like metaphysics, and it is metaphysics. It's something from the metaphysics of time. And we're going to talk about that a lot more in a later lecture, but we're going to talk about some of it today too. So we've got a few ideas of Nietzsche's that are some of his most famous ideas, and how do they all fit together? Well, let's talk more about the Ubermensch. What does it mean to be the Ubermensch? The Ubermensch is someone who is thriving in the most ultimate, greatest possible way. Now, what does it mean to be thriving in the greatest possible way. Well, let's do a thought experiment. Imagine for a second that God exists, and further, that you are God. Well, maybe you've thought about that before, maybe you've never thought about that before, but let's think about it now. What is the relationship between God and the rest of reality supposed to be? Well, the relationship between God and the rest of reality is supposed to be that God created it. And from the point of view of God, it was worth creating. That's the one that he wanted. God is all powerful, so he wouldn't have created anything but the best one he could possibly think of. So imagine now that you have that relationship to all of the rest of reality, that you see the grand total of reality is totally worth it. It was in your power to make the best one, and so you did it. You made it. Reality just is an extension of your will, and your will has willed the best possible reality that it could come up with. So now, okay, that's all fine and good, imagining that you're God, but what's that have to do with us humans? Well, what would it mean to be a human that had a more godlike relationship to value? And the answer becomes, it is to be able to look at reality and say, yes, I would have made this. Imagine being able to look at all of reality and say, you know what, this is the way I would have wanted it. If you're able to honestly say that, then you have achieved the highest level of value. And now you are the Ubermensch. You wouldn't be bummed out by how crappy things are. You would say, yes, I appreciate that things are crappy, but you know what? Yes, I say yes to even the crappy parts. Yes, there's pain and suffering, but I would do it all again. It was totally worth it. Someone who is able to honestly say it was totally worth it is someone who is experiencing the highest amount of value that there is. There is no higher value that could possibly be achieved. If there was, then you would be disappointed at some point. But if you're disappointed at some point, you're not going to say, oh, this is worth it. You're going to say, oh, I wish it could be better. But the point of view of the Ubermensch, when the Ubermensch looks at reality, is to be satisfied. Now, what does this have to do with eternal recurrence? Well, let's talk a little bit about time. We're going to get into more details about time in later units when we get to our metaphysics unit. One sort of question to ask about time is, what is the shape of time? Now, one way in which people think of time is that it's linear, that the shape of time, or we might say the topology of time, is just the shape of a line. There's the past, there's the present, there's the future. Any given point on this line is such that it's going to have some points that are earlier than it and other points that are later than it. And no point that's later than it is also earlier than it. So for any point and any other point, that other point is either earlier and not later, or it's later and not earlier. That's what it means for time to be linear. Now contrast that with looped time or circular time. On a circular model of time, for any given point in time and any other point, that other point is both earlier and later. So let's take a time. Let's take noon, 12 o'clock noon today, and 12:01. Well, 12:01 is 1 minute in the future, but eventually it's going to happen again, so that when 12 noon happens, well, 12:01 was behind it and also in front of it. So each moment in time is such that each other moment exists both in its present and its future. That's what it means for time to be looped. And then another possible model is that time is branching, that for any given moment in time, there are these branches. And this gets discussed in connection with things like quantum mechanics or in connection with time travel. So one way we might put it is, imagine that you're trying to decide where you're going to go for dinner tonight. And you decide, you can't make up your mind, so you're going to flip a coin. Heads, you're going to go out for pizza. Tails, you're going to go to the salad bar. So you flip a coin, it comes up heads, and you then go out for pizza. But the timeline branches, and there becomes another timeline that has another version of you in it. And in that timeline, the coin came up tails, and you ate salad. Now, on this one timeline, you go to the pizza bar and you meet the most wonderful person in the world, and you get married. And uh, in the other timeline, you just eat salad by yourself, and you're very sad and lonely. And then as you're leaving, a news crew sees you and they interview you. You're so sad and lonely. They want to talk to you, find out about your sad, sad story. And the video that they make goes viral, and you become the saddest person in the world. You become super famous, and eventually you are elected president. Back here in this timeline, where you didn't, you ended up meeting someone and falling in love and getting married. You're super happy, but you never become president. There's all these different branching timelines, and there are some pairs of times where there's this one moment and there's this other moment, and this other moment is neither earlier nor later than the first moment. So that's what it means for time to be branching, as opposed to either linear or looped. Now, according to Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence, time is looped. And what we're going to focus on now is an argument for that view. How can you come up with an argument that would have as its conclusion that time has this looped structure? And this is going to be a little bit complicated and get us even deeper into metaphysics, but it's interesting and it's fun to think about, so we're going to do it anyway. So let's talk about a very simple physical system, a coin flipping. Now, many of you are familiar with some basic ideas of probability theory. You know, for example, that if you flip a coin, if it's a fair coin, there's a 50% chance that it's going to come up heads. And you appreciate that if instead of focusing on just a coin flipping one time, if we were to flip it twice and ask what's the probability that it's going to come up heads both times, you appreciate that the probability of it coming up heads both times is a lower probability than if we were just focusing on one coin flip. And one way we might put it is, if we're focusing on one coin flip, there's only two possibilities. It could be either heads or it could be tails. But if we're focusing on two coin flips, now we've got four possibilities. The four possibilities is that both times are heads, or both times are tails, or the first time is heads and the second time is tails, or the fourth possibility is the first time is tails and the second time is heads. So for the first situation, where we're just talking about one coin being flipped, there's a 50% chance of it coming up heads. But if we're talking about two coins being flipped, there is a lower chance, and if we do the math, it's a 25% chance. It is 0.5 times 0.5, that gives you 0.25. And we could keep on asking questions like this. What about 3 coins? What about 7 coins? What if we flip a coin 7 times? What's the probability that it's going to be heads each of those 7 times? The main thing to appreciate is that as we're dealing with a bigger and bigger number of these events, the probability of that turning out is going to be lower. Now let's think about a different sort of situation, one that's a little bit more complex than the one that we're already dealing with. So take, for example, the question of getting 2 heads in a row. Suppose you were to flip a coin 100 times, and a friend of yours flips a coin 1,000 times. Who is more likely to have 3 heads in a row? The person who only flipped it 100 times, or the person that flipped it 1,000 times? Who's more likely to get somewhere in there 3 heads in a row? You might say, well, it's possible that they both do. I'm like, yeah, of course it's possible that they both do. But who is more likely to get it? The person who flips it 1,000 times is more likely that somewhere in there they're going to get 3 in a row. Now, it's also possible that neither of them get it. So we're not talking about what will happen. We're just talking about what is more likely to happen. And a lot of us appreciate how to reason about that. You appreciate that in that question about the 100 flips versus 1,000 flips, if you flipped it 1,000 times, somewhere in there you're more likely to get 3 in a row than the person who only flipped it 100 times. Okay, so now let's take that reasoning and crank it up to infinity. Suppose you were to flip the coin an infinite number of times. What's the probability that somewhere in there you're going to get 3 in a row? Well, I think a lot of you now appreciate that the probability is 100%. You've got a 100% guarantee that somewhere in there it's going to be 3 in a row. And you might say, well, isn't it still possible that it's not? Well, keep a few things in mind here. Number one, this is a fair coin. It's fair. What does it mean to be fair? Well, what it means to be fair is that, for example, if you flip it an infinite number of times, it's going to come up heads about 50% of the time and tails the other 50% of the time. It's not possible for it to be a fair coin and you flip it an infinite number of times and it never comes up heads. If it never came up heads, then that just by definition is not a fair coin. So what it means for it to be a fair coin is that there's going to be an even distribution across this infinite manifold. But now here's another question. Suppose we take what you think of as a really improbable event, like for example getting 100 heads in a row from a fair coin. But suppose you're going to flip the coin an infinite number of times. If you flip a coin an infinite number of times, what's the probability that somewhere in that infinite series you're going to see 100 heads in a row? Answer, it's guaranteed. 100% guaranteed that somewhere in there you're going to get 100 in a row. And I think a lot of people at this point can follow the reasoning. As we increase the number, as we increase the size of this space of possibilities for this finite configuration, the finite configuration is 100 in a row. The infinite space is the infinite number of coin flips. You appreciate that since that space is infinite, then this finite thing is going to happen somewhere in there. And here's another question. How many times is it going to happen in there? How many times in that infinite manifold are there going to be 100 heads in a row? And the answer is an infinite number of times. Now this is a little bit weird because you might think that that means that all of the flips are going to be heads, and that's not true. And this is a special feature about infinity. Just because something is infinite, it doesn't mean it takes up all of infinity. And here's an example. Take the set of whole numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That's an infinite set. Now, the set of even numbers, 2, 4, 6, 8, that's also an infinite set. But not all numbers are even numbers. Not all whole numbers are even numbers. So even though there's an infinite number of even numbers, there's still other numbers that aren't even. So even though in this infinite sequence of coin flips, there are an infinite number of sequences where you've got 100 in a row, that doesn't mean all the sequences are heads. There's going to be lots and lots of sequences that aren't heads, that aren't 100 heads in a row. Infinity is that big. It's so big it could fit other infinities in it. But let's go back and see what the point of this is supposed to be. If you've got a system where there's a finite number of types of situations, like heads versus tails, and you're combining them an infinite number of times, and this is truly random, it's truly fair, a fair coin, then you're going to get eternal recurrence. What's eternal recurrence? It's when the same thing keeps happening forever. So if you've got an infinite number of coin flips, you're going to have 100 heads in a row somewhere in there. And that is going to happen again somewhere else. And it's going to happen again even later on. It's going to recur eternally. Here's another example that's slightly more complicated than the coin flip thing. Imagine a black and white TV screen that is infinitely large. It's infinitely tall and it's infinitely wide. Now, one thing you know about black and white TV screens is that the images are made out of pixels, squares that are either black or white. Now, imagine that each one of these pixels could be either black or it could be white, and further that it's random at any given moment in time whether that pixel is black or it's white. Now, here's a possible finite configuration of pixels. It's a picture of Nietzsche's face. Nietzsche's face in black and white is just a sequence of pixels, each one of which is either black or white. Now, on an infinite black and white TV screen that is just randomly cycling, somewhere on that infinite TV screen is a picture of Nietzsche. And further, there's an infinite number of pictures of Nietzsche on that TV screen. Now, this TV screen is not just a frozen image, it's not just a frozen picture, it's cycling through time. And that means that somewhere in there, on that TV screen, that infinite TV screen, there's a small region that is showing a black and white movie. And further, that black and white movie is showing somewhere else on the screen. How many times? An infinite number of times. That there's an infinite number of regions on that screen where that movie is also playing. Okay, so let's take these different ideas, like the infinite coin flips or the infinite black and white TV screen, and let's apply them to our own reality. And let's make some basic assumptions about our own reality. So first off, our reality has got 3 dimensions of space arranged over a 4th dimension, which is time. There is matter in that space, and the matter decomposes into a finite number of elements, a finite number of chemical elements, like the kind you would see on the periodic table. And the elements are able to combine in just a finite number of ways. If you've taken chemistry, you know about valence shells, you know about the way in which atoms connect to each other to make molecules. And because of the way the valence shells work, there's only a finite number of ways that these Lego pieces can stick to one another. Now, let's suppose that the matter that is sticking together and being arranged in space is arranging itself in a random way. Now let's imagine either that space or time are infinite. We'll take time. Let's have time be infinite. So if we've got an infinite amount of time with this matter that is arranging itself in a random sort of way, what's the likelihood that at some point in that infinite series of time that the whole history of the planet Earth is going to happen again? Well, it's guaranteed that somewhere in that infinite amount of time, all the matter that's arranged itself to be like this, with these people, you and me and everyone else that you know, that's going to happen again. All the atoms are going to rearrange themselves again. Further, every possible alteration, so like a version of human history that's just like this one, except I have a green mohawk, that's going to happen also. So everything that will happen, everything that can happen will happen, and further, it will happen an infinite number of times. So that's the basic idea of eternal recurrence. So now what you're supposed to do if you want to be an Ubermensch is you take the idea of eternal recurrence and you ask yourself, could you look at all of that in your mind and say, yes, I will that to be such. I want that kind of reality. If you're able to do that, then you have achieved the highest level of value, that you're truly flourishing as a human being. One way Nietzsche puts the point is to say, what if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more. And there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even this spider and this moonlight between the trees and even this moment and I myself, the eternal hourglass of existence, is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, a speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal? So the thought experiment that you're supposed to conduct is to imagine this demon coming to you and saying, you know what, everything that has ever happened and can happen will happen again and again and again and again. Now, what frame of mind are you in? Are you in the frame of mind that's going to get really depressed at that thought and become overwhelmed by it? Well, then you're not an Ubermensch, and you're not experiencing the highest level of value that you could possibly experience life. On the other hand, if you look at all that and say, you know what, bring it on. I want that. That's exactly the way I want it to be. Then you are an Ubermensch. You are a super person. You're a superman or a super lady, and you are living life at its fullest. And that's what it means to flourish, to have human flourishing, at least in a Nietzschean framework. Okay, well, we've had some samples of virtue ethics and a general overview of what virtue ethics is supposed to be. Let's take a look at some study questions and then call it quits. Okay, so they're all true, false questions this time around. Number one, true or false? A virtue ethicist is more likely than a Kantian to agree that it is sometimes morally justified to lie, steal, and even to kill. Number two, the idea that an ethical theory should be based on moral psychology and an account of human flourishing fits better with Kantianism than with virtue ethics. And number three, the idea that the rightness of action is the most basic ethical property fits better with Kantianism than with virtue ethics. Okay, so there's 1, 2, and 3. And let's just cut right now to the answers. The answers are, number 1 is true, 2 is false, and 3 is false. So number 1 was, a virtue ethicist is more likely than a Kantian to agree that it is sometimes morally justified to lie, steal, and even to kill. Well, one thing you should remember about Kant is that he did not allow exceptions to the moral law. So whatever you know about virtue ethics, you know that it's not going to be Kant that agrees that it's sometimes morally justified to lie, steal, and even to kill. It wouldn't be Kant. So it's going to have to be the opposite. It's going to have to be the virtue ethicist. The virtue ethicist is more likely to agree that sometimes it's morally justified to lie, to steal, even to kill. Well, how could, say, Aristotle say that? Well, maybe there's certain conditions in which that's the courageous thing to do. The courageous thing is to kill somebody. Maybe you're killing them in self-defense. He's not saying it's okay to kill all the time, but maybe once in a while you have to kill. True or false? The idea that an ethical theory should be based on moral psychology and an account of human flourishing fits better with Kantianism than with virtue ethics. False. That fits better with virtue ethics. And then 3, the idea that the rightness of action is the most basic ethical property fits better with Kantianism than with virtue ethics. That's true. So let's see. Wait a minute. I think I wrote the answers down wrong. Okay, so the first one, true or false, a virtue ethicist is more likely than a Kantian to agree that it is sometimes morally justified to lie, steal, even to kill. That is false. A virtue ethicist is not more likely. No, that's true. A virtue ethicist is more likely than a Kantian to agree that it is sometimes morally justified to lie, steal, and even to kill. That's true. Okay. Number 2, the idea that an ethical theory should be based on moral psychology and an account of human flourishing fits better with Kantianism than with the virtue ethics. That's false. Okay. And then 3, the idea that the rightness of action is the most basic ethical property fits better with Kantianism than with virtue ethics. That should be true. I'm going to change that right now. Number 3 is true. All right, well, sorry about that. Even the professor makes mistakes. And when the professor makes mistakes, hopefully the professor fixes the mistakes. And if you catch some mistakes, you let me know. And maybe there'll be some extra credit in it for you. Okay, that's all fixed. Well, thank you for being patient with that. But just in summary, we've looked over the questions, 1, 2, and 3, and we now know that the answers are true, false, true. Until next time, keep it philosophical. This is Dr. Pete Mandic, and our next lecture, we're going to start our epistemology unit. Until then, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.